I have to tell you that as an energy journalist, the absolute bane of my existence is the Alberta government. I get press releases about oil and gas all the time, once a day, twice a day, sometimes. And the government will take every opportunity to make a statement and put out a press release about any little wrinkle, anything positive, any way that it can pound its message again and again and again. And it just, no other government acts like this. I get, as a journalist, I'm on all kinds of lists. I get press releases from different governments, some in Canada, some outside of Canada, different organizations. Nobody does this. A PR agency, and I get lots of pitches from PR agencies who have clients in the energy industry. They would be embarrassed to behave like this. And, today I got one, it was a joint statement from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, and they were making some statement that they've made a million times before, but they put another little wrinkle on it, and so it came a press release, and probably there was a video announcement, and the problem here is that there's so much spin, there's so much torque on these stories that they're virtually unusable because you have to fact check every little bit. So just as an example, I spend a lot of time in greenhouse gas emissions data for Alberta. In the data that comes from the Environment and Climate Change Canada, which assembles the National Inventory Report. They give you a spreadsheet for every province and then Canada as a whole. And you can go in there and they give you breakdowns by the big economic sectors like oil and gas and transportation and industry and what have you. And then they give you subsectors. And they break it down fairly, at quite a granular level. And you can chart them out and you can see them over time from like 1990 to 2023. And it's pretty clear that Alberta's emissions are not going down. At best, they've plateaued. And there are a couple sectors, like the natural gas, where they a big push over the last 7-8 years to reduce methane emissions, and so emissions have gone down there. That's great, but they've risen in other places like the oil sands. But they'll torque stuff like, oh, emissions are falling. No, they're not falling. Oil sands emissions are falling. No, the emissions intensity per barrel are falling. Absolute emissions is not the same thing. You're giving people the wrong impression. And this happens over and over and over again. And Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, is like Donald Trump. I mean, you can't fact check her because in any given statement, there'll be 6 things wrong. I'd do a whole half-hour video explaining, no, she was wrong in this area, and the data says this, and then she's wrong over here, and then she's wrong over there. It's just a blizzard of wrong. And sometimes, like I said, so much of it that it's like Trump. You say, well, at some point she's lying because, there's the volume of inaccuracies and she gets corrected sometimes and just continues on with it. So this is what I get in press releases all the bloody time. And the problem is that the government begins to look exactly like a trade association. And the one that comes to mind in my experience is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Now, I started getting comments from them about 2009, 2010. At that time, Dave Collier was the CEO, and he had run Shell Canada. He was an old oil and gas engineer, very facts-oriented, very traditional, and he would take tough questions, and he would tell you what he could say, tell you what he couldn't say, and he would be very precise, and I had a lot of respect for Dave. And his VP of Communications, Janet Annesley, was exactly the same way. She would say, Markham, we could say this, we can't say that. That's not true, that's not accurate. And full disclosure, Janet has since become a friend of mine, and I've watched her in other jobs that she's had in the energy industry, and she acts like a consummate pro. Then a new CEO came in and a new crop of comms people, and it resembles the Alberta government. It was just this constant onslaught of torque, and spin. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story. In 2019, there was an election, and the UCP had just been formed, and Jason Kenney was running, and Rachel Notley, the NDP premier, was running for re-election. And the CEO of CAP, Tim McMillan, had made a statement, I think it was at the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, and he said something like, environmentalists have caused tens of thousands of job losses in the industry, something like that. And I emailed the CAP and I said, look, this is not true. I'm looking at the job data over the last 10, 15 years here in the Alberta oil and gas. It's simply inaccurate. It's not true for a whole bunch of reasons. And they came back and said, well, no, we're standing by the statement. And, and I said, well, where do you get the information? Oh, we got it from some source, which turned out to be highly suspect. And that's a whole risk for another conversation when we talk about Vivian Krause. But anyway, so he used a suspect source to justify it. And when I came back and said, the data doesn't support it, they sent me back an email and they said, we're no longer talking to you. We find it, you're not easy to deal with. You're not, I forget the exact wording of it, but it was something to that effect. It's no longer profitable for us to deal with you. So we're just going to stop answering your emails. Well, you're going to blackball a reporter just because they wouldn't take no when your CEO was obviously, if he wasn't lying, he was, pretty close to it. And it certainly was inaccurate information. And you're going to defend that? And Alberta government looks just like CAP does now. Spin, spin, spin. And the problem is that you can never believe anything. And this is true with Danielle Smith. It's just like Donald Trump. I remember when Donald Trump was first elected in 2016, 2017, and the American journalists had a hell of a time with it because they didn't know, the volume of inaccurate information was so great. It was a tsunami of it and they didn't want to call the president a liar. I mean, aside from maybe Richard Nixon in his latter years, you just didn't do that. You respected the office and you expected that the president was mostly telling the truth, and you wouldn't call the president a liar. And it took them a couple of years to wrap their heads around the fact that they now had a president who just fibbed all the time. Didn't know a fact if it bit him in the ass. And Danielle Smith is very much the same way, except she's smoother. She's much smoother than Donald Trump is. And it's quite amazing how good a communicator she's become. And she'll just roll stuff out off the, off her tip of her tongue. And I go, hey, hang on a second, that's not right. Well, that's not right. And, I could spend my entire day, all day, every day, correcting Danielle Smith's public statements. But, what's the point of that? After a while, you give up and you got to move on. You point it out when the opportunity comes. But that's what the Alberta government is like. It's does the industry spin all the time? And if you think the press releases are bad, go to the Twitter, now X, Elon Musk's X, and check out the accounts for Danielle Smith, Brian Jean, the Minister of Energy, and Rebecca Schultz, the Environment Minister, who may as well be the Minister of Energy because all she does is say nice things about oil and gas all day long. But they are just a veritable spin, and you never get any accurate information. Nobody will look you in the eye and give it to you straight and take the tough questions and maybe say, hang on a second, I got to get back to you on that kind of stuff. Oh, no. There are, as I think I mentioned earlier, there are PR professionals who would be embarrassed if their clients acted in that fashion. And this is what makes my life interesting all the time, is wading through the blizzard of cow patties that come out of the Alberta government. And you know what makes it even worse? Is that a lot of my colleagues in the Alberta news media, they're like stenographers. They just repeat what the government says, what the Premier says, what Jean says, what Schultz says. They just repeat it. And they don't do any fact checking, and they don't know the issues well enough to know, like when it comes to emissions, if you don't go through the data and you don't spend time graphing things out and making yourself familiar with it, when the Premier says, oh, emissions are dropping, how would you know? That's hard, I get it. But as a reporter, you have an obligation to go and do that kind of work. And they don't do that kind of work. So if you've got a receptive news media, that really it doesn't, there's not much rigor to it and you're not being held to account. And I should say there are some exceptions. Emma Graney at the Globe and Mail is very good, a few others, but they're the exception, not the rule. And so if you had that scenario, why wouldn't you just send out this tsunami of baloney all the time, because you know that it's going to get picked up. It's going to get picked up by the radio stations, which have skeleton crews in the newsroom if they have anybody. Pretty soon it's going to be AI. And the AI reporters will pick up those press releases and regurgitate it, and an AI voice will read it out over the radio. Or, if they're not doing it already, it's coming. And so that's how they get away with it. And it's really hard because it takes independent reporters like me who do the digging and do familiarize themselves with the data and find the evidence and interview the experts and so on to give you a more balanced, technical, accurate take on these energy issues. They're not really technical. That probably bore you to death most of the time. But better to bore you to death with facts and give it to you straight than to do the opposite and just be a stenographer for the torque mill that is the Alberta government. Trust me.